Price elasticity of demand. Not as complicated as it may sound. It's basically just about price sensitivity. How price sensitive is a product? How much do consumers care about the price? And will they willingly switch from one product to another based on that, or change their behaviour based on a change in price? If you imagine, for example, your local hairdressers, if they put their prices up by 20%, how many less customers would they get because their price had gone up? Or if they cut their prices by 5%, how many more customers would they get? So it's quite simple from that point of view. And we can show it on this diagram with this downward sloping demand curve, so a typical demand curve, but I've made it quite shallow. I've made it less than 45 degrees. Now, as I've explained in previous videos, it should really be a curve, but for simplicity's sake, because it's flat, relatively shallow, less than 45 degrees, we'll call it an elastic demand curve. And what that means is that, as you can see, when there's a change in price, a relatively small one, the change in quantity demanded is a lot bigger. And that's to do with the gradient of this demand curve. If the demand curve was very, very steep, if it was what we call inelastic, you would get something very, very different happening. But here on this elastic demand curve, a small change in price leads to a much larger change in the quantity demanded. Now, in the real world, if you imagine two brands of beans on a supermarket shelf, both very, very similar, not a huge amount of brand loyalty for consumers between the two. If one brand, if they cut their price by 10%, what will tend to happen is people will switch from the other brand to that brand because it's that bit cheaper. And a number of people will do that because the beans are similar enough so people aren't too worried. Equally, if that brand put its prices up by 10%, people may think, I'm not going to buy that brand anymore. I will switch from that brand to the other brand because that other brand is now slightly cheaper, and a significant number of people will make that switch. And you tend to get elastic demand in markets where there is a lot of competition, where there are a number of substitutes, and those substitutes are similar enough that consumers are happy to switch from one substitute to another. Now, if you wanted to work it out mathematically using an equation, looks complicated but really isn't. You have your percentage change, the triangle sign, percentage change in price, and you have your percentage change in quantity demanded, and it's quantity demanded over price. Now, it's all about percentages, not about actual numbers. So if the price of beans goes from 40 up to 44p, that isn't a 4p change, it's a 10% change, 40 up to 44. And just remember, with percentages, if you go back down again from 44 to 40p, that's not 10%. So check your maths on that one. The mathematicians amongst you will get that straight away. Other people might be scratching their head a bit now, but you need to know your percentages if you're going to work out price elasticity using this formula. But once you've got your percentages, if you've got a 10% change in price and a 40% change in quantity demanded, you do 40 over 10 equals 4, and 4 is your price elasticity of demand. Now, technically, the very clever amongst you might think that should be a minus figure, but convention dictates that we tend to do price elasticity of demand as a positive number. So in an example where you've got a 10% change in price, which leads to a 40% change in quantity demanded, you do 40 over 10, gives you a PED, price elasticity of demand, of 4. And because this number is greater than 1, it means that the product is elastic. And in another video I will be looking at inelastic demand, and in that example you will find that it will have a PED of less than 1, for example 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.85. But anything greater than 1, when you do the calculation, it's a PED which is elastic.